Did you know I finally figured out how to get this Logitech StreamCam wide on OBS, because before it was just like a box. It's something to do with the settings. Anyway, hi everyone. Today I released my video about the new procedural patterns pack, and that included some kind of tutorial, but releasing one video wasn't really enough for me to satiate my productivity, so we're going to do a little discussion about modularity. And this is related to the video that went out today. You see, one of the reasons why I made that pack is because if I set my sights on larger projects, which I know are too much of a time investment for me to do in just one sitting, the easiest way for me to approach those in the long term is to break them down into smaller chunks. So one example of a larger project in this case would be the modular metals pack. So I want to do modular concrete, modular ceramics, modular plastics, or all stuff like that. But really, maintaining a productive outlook on large projects is not just as simple as breaking them down into smaller parts. If your attention is as easily distractible as mine is, then you'll know that that doesn't really work all of the time. You need to kind of trust yourself that you will come back around and become reinterested in the same projects again and again. And every time you come round, you tackle another smaller chunk of it. So if this makes sense, you're knocking them off as you go around in a cycle. So the next time you come back around, you'll assess the chunks that you've already done for that project and then see, okay, well, I've done this, this, and this. The next one is this. And I still want to make that big project. So every time you come back around, you get closer and closer and closer to the final result. That's my general outlook for achieving large-scale projects. As a singular person doing all kinds of projects across multiple fields, different types of industries technically, it's very difficult, or nay, maybe even impossible, for one person to achieve some of these projects if they just walked in a straight line from start to finish. So I want to take a moment today to discuss the question, is modularity the key to productivity? Now, like most of my discussion stuff, I always hate seeing things in very black and white terms. It's just a general policy for my life. I don't like that kind of linear thinking, but I know that it's hypocritical to think that way, because even in distinguishing black and white thinking from non-black and white thinking, you're doing a kind of absolutist black and white thought about it. So there's a lot of hypocrisy in the philosophy of just thinking in general. But anyway, we can put all of that aside. We can talk about psychological hypocrisies any day. Modularity, problem and solution. A problem when approaching projects is the time to start. Let's say you want to make an animated film, an animated short, and you have no assets, no templates, no tools, no add-ons. You just have your skill set. Well, you're going to look at that project and go, oh my God, that's an intense workload, depending on the type of animated project you want to do. Going from an absolute starting point to, say, making your first scene may be quite a huge leap, especially if you haven't made any of your characters or any of your environments and stuff like that. There is a huge chunk of time there. And in the time that you will invest in getting all that way, there are so many points of frustration to occur. And frustration is a very dangerous thing, especially when you're working alone, working on projects, because any one of those frustration moments can immediately kick your motivation out the window and you'll stop. But we'll make a note about frustration and come back to that in a minute. So modularity, in a sense, and recycling your content can help you to skip to a starting point that's further along the workflow. Now, in this example, we're making a comparison between modular thinking and recycling content. So what I mean is, if you've made content in the past, environments, characters, rigs, add-ons even, that's modularity, where we can compartmentalize them and reuse them as modules. So you can append them or link them to other projects, basically take them out and reuse them. You don't need to use them all at the same time. You don't need to use them all for every single project. You can just pick and choose them as you like. Now, that's a smart way to recycle your work, and sometimes it takes a bit more effort. So for example, if I make a unique art piece from the ground up, sometimes what I'll do is I'll take all the things that I use to make that, say the materials, the models, and the lighting setups, and then strip them down and turn those into modular recyclable parts. I don't do that all the time. It's only when I can really be bothered to do it. I think I spent most of the time doing it for kit bash pieces in the past. So it takes more effort that way because you have to invest more time into deconstructing your scene after the fact, which you probably won't want to do because you've already spent so long trying to get it right. But you never know when those pieces that you create are going to become useful for you again in the future. So that's foresight thinking for modularity. Another problem that modularity tries to tackle is that lots of manual effort is required to make changes in projects when everything has been built from the ground up. So for example, when thinking about material packs, if we're working on multiple layers of different node groups, if every large project you do is bespoke, where you have no exact conventions between the uniformity of how inputs and outputs connect together, then changing something at a lower level of abstraction, so more granular detail, is a lot harder when you have to go through all these different abstract layers, right? So if you reapproach the project again in the future, you have to reteach yourself what everything means and how things connect together. By using modular systems with conventions for layouts that you should ideally design for yourself, you'll be able to look at that and go, okay, well, I understand that this is the same as it is in every other project. It's a module that I'm used to seeing, so I immediately understand what it does, and I immediately know how to modify this. Modularity also allows for parametric control, because it's very easy to understand where the different layers are defined in modular systems, layers of abstraction, I mean. And by abstraction, we just mean where things at a higher level require fewer changes to control more things at a lower level. So if you change simple values at the top of the list, then you can control hundreds, thousands, millions of different values at the bottom of the list. So parameters allow for abstract control in modular systems, allowing many layers of detail to be controlled at once, which is fantastic for providing power to an artist. So what does all of this translate to? Well, number one, it leads to a higher output of a more consistent quality. Higher output because we are skipping a starting point. So we already have something to work with, and a more consistent quality because by reusing modules, you're forced to reuse conventions that you've already designed in the past rather than inventing the wheel from the ground up every time you start a project. This also translates to a more enjoyable experience as possible frustration bottlenecks can be avoided. Because as we said, every place where the investment of time has expanded as a necessity of not having pre-prepared stuff, it invites more points for frustration, especially if you are leaning into skill sets that you don't have much experience with. But a more specific way of how modularity solves this is that once a problem to a solution has been found, you don't need to rediscover the solution. You can just re-import the solution. You don't necessarily have to reteach yourself how that solution works. You just know, okay, this is the solution. I've imported it. I'm going to use it. So the cognitive effort required to not just understand the problem and solution, but also invent the problem and solution has now been eliminated. So are there any problems or issues that modular designs or approaches to project management can create? And yeah, I suppose there are. So repetition would be one problem. If you are reusing the same pre-prepared content across all of your projects, then things might start to look the same. And that's especially true if we talk about very visual things like artistic projects. But is that repetition necessarily a bad thing? Well, I think that depends on your take for what an artistic style is. Because we see this so much with artists which focus most of their work around kit bashing, just reusing the same kit bash pieces over and over and over again. On the surface, the works look quite impressive. You know, there's an extreme amount of detail, but if you look closely, you can identify the repeating patterns and see it across all of their work. And then you think, okay, well, the magic has kind of been lost now. It looked impressive to start with, but now just looking and re-identifying those same patterns, it feels low effort. It removes some of the magic behind purpose. So does kit bashing and modular design for artistry like this turn us away from fundamental artistic principles and key skills at lower levels of abstraction in the design process? And what I mean by that, a lower level would be, say, just hand modeling something. If we're using kit bash pieces to do all of our artwork, then we're not really making any new models. So does modular thinking in that way lead us away from important skills? I think it depends to how far you are restricting yourself into different scopes of those layers of abstraction in modular design. I think it's a good idea if you're making packs of content to keep trying to refresh the lower levels with extra stuff. I think it keeps your mind working. If you're doing a kit bash pack, then it keeps you modeling and making new pieces and then learning new ways to transition shapes together. I think if you're doing a material pack, then making sure to work on your lower level patterns to see if there's any ways to improve them without running the risk of running into optimization issues, because of course, if you keep adding to content in the node groups, then it's just more computation time. And that might be the case even if they're not being used, because I've heard that even in Eevee, if nodes aren't being used, they're still being calculated, I think. Might need to double check up on that one. And it's not to say that only focusing on things from an abstract level, like a higher level in terms of modularity, is a bad thing, because it can teach you some managerial skills and project management skills. At every layer of the work, there should always be extra work that can be done. So the idea of repetition brings us on to procedural generation in general. But one example I'd like to talk about is for video game worlds. So one prime complaint for the use of procedural generation in video games is that the worlds become repetitive quite quickly. Procedural art systems, especially for video games, typically work in modular ways where modular parts and pieces are semi-randomly selected based on categorical properties and then combined together using a predefined rule set of some kind. So for example, for a creature generation, you would take a head piece or a body piece. You'd usually start with the body because more things grow out from that, and the body may define a set of rules for what else can be placed there and where things move, possibly even randomized parameters like, say, how fast a creature moves, or like the tone or depth of its voice, and maybe even separate randomized properties will be chosen for things like personality. So is it angry? Is it, hostile? Is it hungry? Is it friendly? How does it behave when it's around the player and stuff like that? So for the question of whether choosing all these things together and creating something new is a repetitive action from the perception of like a player or a user, that raises the question of at what scale does something become easily identifiable as a repeating pattern for the viewer? I think it really depends, because when we take a look at games like No Man's Sky, the terrain generation is quite interesting, but it is quite repetitive. I mean, in terms of just general shapes. We could say that one reason for that is because the rule set for the system is not wide enough or saturated enough, or doesn't allow for enough variety, or doesn't have the right rules to stimulate us enough to the point where we feel like we've seen something new. I think it would be a misconception just to say that wider variety leads to less repetition, because generated noise can come in a virtually limitless number of combinations, but noise is still just noise to us. The thing that makes something genuinely interesting is probably more centered around the fact that it will have a more grounded approach in reality. Looking at a procedurally generated world in a 3D game that's generated mostly from a sine wave or a saw wave isn't really that different and isn't really that interesting, but something generated from an erosion simulation is much more interesting. It's much more grounded in reality. And I feel like we probably as humans have some kind of instinctive sense that that's more realistic. That's more intriguing. I can kind of visualize myself in it, even if it feels kind of like a liminal space where it's kind of stuck in this uncanny visual between something that might be real and something that definitely is not. It would also be a misconception to kind of say that scale is the only problem when it comes to identifying repeating patterns, because even if in a video game you're generating things on the atomic level, so atom after atom after atom, and then zooming out to the point where the player can usually see, it doesn't matter if you're building things from the smallest possible scale, because if the rule set is so vague in general that it produces similar patterns at that higher level of abstraction where the player is, then they're still going to be identifying repeating patterns. So the problem in that case is not the modular components that build up the system, it's the rule set behind the modular components. Now, all of that's just a really extremely fancy way to answer the question, is repetition a problem with modular systems? And by extension, for examples, kit bashing and stuff like that, the answer is no, repetition isn't really the problem in terms of thinking about the pieces. It's how you use the pieces, as in the rule set to which they're applied. You see, if someone doing sci-fi artwork with kit bash pieces uses the same radar piece in the same way every time, then of course it's going to be easily identifiable. But if that person explores unused angles of the radar dish, maybe they flip it upside down, scale it up and use it as a dome for an architectural piece, or maybe they use it in strange ways to layer them together like a lattice shape and then use it to build like limbs for some kind of robotic creature, then maybe that's more interesting because that's a different rule set of applying the same pieces. Now, that's not to say that the rule set is the only thing at fault. Obviously, the number of pieces also has a significant impact, because when you think about, again, I'll take the example of No Man's Sky for a video game, you can see so many of the same like creature heads being used over and over and over again. And I think that's a case where scale and piece selection is important, because it doesn't matter if you have like 500,000 different types of head, eventually they're all going to become identifiable. And it can raise the question, is there actually a number of pieces that need to be created for a human to enjoy an experience for their entire life before they start seeing repeating patterns? And I don't think there's a good answer for that. I think the solution for procedural systems like that is to stop using parts-based generation and to instead invest time into generating pieces that themselves are generated from external rule sets. So for example, creature generation, get rid of all the parts generation stuff because that's easily repetitive and identifiable, and create a smart system which pays attention to the surrounding variables that represent the planet, and then have the finite values of that dictate the kind of general shape for the creature, how it forms, how big it is, and maybe you can take into consideration things like, oxygen absorption for size and all that kind of jazz, and then work from there, because then it becomes a bit more grounded in reality, even if the rule set isn't the same as real life. I guess we can say that realistic doesn't necessarily mean following our reality. It just means that the output should be rationally conceivable when compared to other rule sets in the same system. So creatures should look like they could be conceivably generated in relation to this planet, rather than being just generated as something separately and then placed on top. One of the reasons why I like the application of procedural systems, generative modeling, modular design, is that it lowers the barrier for entry in terms of starting new projects. It can help us to encourage self-inspiration loops because we're jumping over points in the workflow, we're reducing frustration, we're feeling more excited by seeing high quality results at a faster pace. I think that just generally helps with keeping yourself enjoying the process of making content. This is why generally I believe that recycling your work in smart ways is quite an essential part of the process. You know, I don't think I'd be having anywhere near as much fun with making content if I was just working from like the default settings and default content all the time. I really like having the ability to create my own templates for software, and I wish that more software allowed for the kind of flexibility that Blender does in that regard, especially in terms of making themes as well. I find that literally the visuals of the color make a big difference to me and my mood when using software. So for example, I've been using ClickUp a lot for productivity recently, and this has a light and a dark mode. And of course, I usually always use dark mode for everything, but I found that there's something significantly different in terms of like the mood when I'm using the light mode for the software. It just feels more professional. And I noticed this a while back when doing web design. Dark feels more fun, but white feels more professional and clean and medical. And I think white also brings a higher sense of value to something because of that. So now when I'm using ClickUp as my organizational software during the day, I switch it back to light mode because I just feel better about using it like that. It gets me into that fresh, bright kind of business mind headspace. But of course, I don't use Discord in light mode because the theme for that's just quite disgusting. But it has got me thinking, I would like a way to be able to swap between Blender themes really easily without having to go through the user preferences, just like a click of a button. If I had a light and my regular dark Blender theme, would the type of content I make also change depending on what theme I had active? I think it might do actually, maybe not for other people, but for me, definitely. I can imagine myself being slower and more meticulous and precise with design work, maybe some kind of computer-aided design type stuff, even though Blender's not really made for that. But I think using a Blender light mode might actually feel quite good when doing that type of work. And then the dark mode would be good for doing more emotional, fun, just kind of randomized and improvised types of artwork. Anyway, I feel like we're rolling off the track a bit here, but this entire video has just been me rambling about disconnected points of modularity and proceduralism and whatever. Sometimes it's fun just to talk about random stuff. Anyway, if you're still listening, I hope you've been doing something productive while you've been listening to this, maybe even playing something. I consider playing games productive to a certain degree. I feel like it's a very good way to inspire yourself into new ideas, a bit like going into the shower. I always have some of my best ideas in the shower, but also while playing video games. I suppose it depends like how far on autopilot you are while you're kind of running through different video game tasks. Anyway, I should probably close this one up, so I hope you're doing well, and I will see you next time.